There we go.
Okay. Well, hello, you beautiful people, and welcome to another edition of Performance Ensemble in Conversation. And my name is Jefferson Denham. I'm one of the hosts.
And I am Fernando Martinez, the other shiny host.
Right, right. And so we're so glad that you're joining us today. And we're going to talk about a couple of things that we hope that you'll find pertinent to your life. And especially if you are interested in performance ensemble, if you've been a part of it in the past, or if you'd like to be a part of it in the future. That's what today is all about. And I say that, Fernando, because as we were talking right before we hit record, I mean, first of all, we've touched on this so many times in our conversations that one of the cool things about performance ensemble is that it addresses what's happening in the here and now, right? It's a living, breathing thing. And it's never just a museum piece. It's like, what is happening to you, me, the culture right now? And then performance ensemble interprets that and embodies that, lets it kind of have its way with us so that we can all come up with this, a sense of what is our voice? What is our response to blah, whatever that is. And so for today, dear audience, we want to just kind of talk about something that's been in the news recently. You've probably seen it, two things actually. So we'll start with the first one. The first topic that I wanted to kind of get into was the idea of curriculum, okay? Who gets to say what curriculum we are exposed to? And in specific, I'm talking about critical race theory. So critical race theory, and Fernando, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but critical race theory is simply looking at, with eyes wide open, how different ethnicities have experienced life. And is there a way that we can be more inclusive in what we do, more aware, and also to kind of own up to maybe some of the things that we've been blind to. I guess that's two parts of the same coin, both two sides of the same coin. Am I right? Is there more you'd like to add to that very generic definition?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of definitions out there, but I think that adding to that, because I think that's actually a really important part of it, is also the fact that, you also look at the world working in a way that's not natural, because a lot of it is a social construct. The idea that race in critical race theory is a social construct, right? So a lot of the things that are happening because we choose to make it, or those empowered choose to make it that way.
Mm.
And I think that's really important for people to understand. And I bring that up because of what we're going to talk about today, because people don't see the full picture, especially in the South, unfortunately. So, yeah.
Right. So quickly, if you go to Wikipedia, which I'm sure, there's, but do your own research. Just as a very broad definition, critical race theory began in the mid 1970s. Definitely, certain scholars decided it was time to turn a critical eye towards race. And so it's based on two common themes. The first is that of an ingrained sort of white supremacy. And when I say those words, I think most people think KKK, but I think I'm more talking about how society has been set up, certainly in America, to benefit the white race and white perspectives. So it's just kind of critical race theory is looking at that as sort of a given and recognizing that that exists, right? And then the second is transforming the relationship between law and racial power, and also achieving racial, this is what I'm reading from here, emancipation and anti-subordination, if that is possible to do. But like they always say, Fernando, you can't deal with a problem unless you recognize the problem. And it seems to me that politically, you can see why certain legislatures, certain states don't want to deal with this, because it's advocating for giving a voice to those who are not white at the table. And most people, I'm not going to go so far as to say that legislatures in red states are like a South Africa, what that was with apartheid. But I think it is to do with power. I think it is to do with power. And to recognize how maybe a power was not, you know, set up to be equal for all, even though, and as Martin Luther King says, you know, we can still aspire to the ideals of America, but you got to at least recognize that there's a problem. Would you say that's a good place to start?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that yeah, so okay, so because the way that I often think about it too, and I don't even know if this is like going a little bit off the rails here, but um whenever we hear of critical race theory and then the drama that it causes in other places, right? Like people being upset over teaching critical race theory. I mean, there's been news of people getting fired for teaching racism, like teaching about racism. I mean, um, is that people sort of look at it as this. I don't know. They just look at it at this like look at it as a crazy liberal idea, right? And people don't realize that critical race theory isn't even liberal. It's like it's just a leftist thing, you know. They're very critical of the majority of the political spectrum because everybody is sort of at fault there.
Mm.
But I think that, like you said, one of the starting points is recognizing that there is a problem, and that's the whole point of this, right? Is that it recognizes that it's that there is a problem, and it tells you exactly what that problem is. That at the institutional and organizational level, things are done or upheld by those in power that are typically men, that are typically white, that are typically older, that will not allow others who are not white, that are not men, to have those exact same powers, right? Um, yeah, so I think that a good starting point is recognizing that there is a problem. And I think that if you study this theory, or if you look at um, if you try to understand your world through this lens, you recognize that there is a problem in a lot of things that we see. um, Even today, even in California, that's considered super liberal, right? Even in LA, that's considered extremely liberal. Like there is a problem everywhere, and I think that's a good starting point.
You know, it seems like yes, and what we're talking about is not necessarily shaming. I think what happens is folks who are in power or not in power and happen to be white feel like, oh, you're just shaming me for something that I had nothing to do with. You know, like let's say Reconstruction or slavery. I wasn't around then. So why do you keep bringing it up? And one of the criticisms that I've heard, maybe you've heard others, and I don't want to bring this up as sort of a straw man that we can knock down. I want to bring this up as a legitimate concern from folks who are white and in power. They feel like, oh, this is, I should, let me stop and say, I'm not sure if this is a legitimate concern or just a PR sort of ploy, but they say, oh, well, if you want to create sort of unity, if you want to create conversation, why do you want to focus on critical race theory? All that does is heighten the divide between us versus let's just get on with it, right? Have you heard such uh, statements before?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So, in trying to be fair and listening to what people might say against critical race theory, one of the things I've heard said is that, oh, well, you're just bringing up division when we should be all about creating reconciliation and getting along.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't like it because they feel like that just stirs up this kind of animosity between races. What would you say to a comment like that?
Um, I think I think the perfect response to understanding that response, because I think that I get really frustrated when I hear that. Um, and this is a quote that I've been seeing a lot recently, and it's by Franklin Leonard, who's the founder of the Blacklist, and I believe he's also a producer, a television producer, or yeah, television producer, and also an editor for a magazine. But his quote is, "When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression." You know, and so when I think about that quote, that's what I think about when people respond with, well, shouldn't we try to focus more on uniting people rather than dividing people? When you talk about race, you're just dividing us. But it's typically white people who say that, who do not,
Yeah.
experience um, the hardship of just being non-white, right? And obviously that doesn't mean that like every person who is a person of color experiences the same thing, because they don't. There's some people who do have certain privileges. I mean, like, even though I'm a person of color, I do have certain privileges because I'm a man, right? I do have certain privileges because I'm educated, like I have a degree. Um, but when I hear that, I feel like that response lacks critical thinking. And I'm saying this, like you said earlier, not in a way to shame or to hound people, but it really does sound like it's a response made without the use of critical thinking skills, because
Right.
your reaction is clearly just out of emotion rather than logic, right? Because it's a failure to wanting to understand what the actual issue is.
I think that's a profound answer, I think. And if you're watching, please be processing these for yourself as well. But I think overall, and we're going to tie this into performance ensemble as well throughout our conversation. And so one of the cool things I feel about performance ensemble is that it's the idea of letting you in on perspectives that you may not know about, right? And so most of us are operating within our bubble, and we think, okay, this is the way life is, this is the way life should be, based on my upbringing, based on my experiences. And what happens, unfortunately, is we don't recognize the world around us. Like, we'll look at somebody who's not achieving. I read a great quote the other day, something about, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like this, that we look at the poor and we think they're not doing something right. And we look at the rich and we think that's what I aspire to be. And we don't recognize that why are we vilifying the poor instead of vilifying the people that keep them poor because of the way ingrained systems that are part of our society. And so when we talk about critical race theory or just even questioning the way things are, we're not trying to make people, as you said, and as I've said, we're not trying to make people feel shame for the sake of feeling shame. I think we're advocating for this sense of um, really understanding empathy towards other. And so when I see a piece that in performance ensemble that just gives me an insight into how people think, how people feel, you start to recognize my way of looking at the world and my way of looking at life is just, it can be myopic at certain points where you're not recognizing there's a lot more. It's sort of like being colorblind to a lot of different colors on the spectrum, and you're recognizing, wow, there's a lot of colors here, and being open to discovering those kinds of things. Would you say that's kind of a strength of performance ensemble? That's my take anyway.
Yeah, I think yeah, so I actually want to compare a lot of what's good in the strengths of the ensemble with the way that we have certain conversations, right? And this is why I'm really enjoying this topic, because obviously a social issue worth discussing, but it also just directly translates to something that can be said on stage. But it's that conversation where people argue that talking about issues of race or issues of privilege or issues of whatever, of etc., right? That it is uncomfortable. But it's only uncomfortable for people that are in a position of privilege because they don't like having to hear that, because they think that that automatically makes them the bad person when it necessarily doesn't. But it does have to recognize them as somebody being in a position of privilege, right? So what does that mean? Like, that means they have to take certain steps to make sure that they're not using their privilege for bad, but rather using it for good, right? And I think that translating that onto the stage is also very similar. And I always use that example of when PE went to Pedagene, and this was like after you and I were done with PE, but they had gone to Pedagene, and
Can you explain what pedagene is if someone is
yeah,
just watching for the first time?
yeah. So Pedagene is, well, I mean, it's a national park that's out in Arkansas, but it's also a yearly a performance art festival, where schools across the country, typically those schools in the South, travel to. They stay there for about a weekend, I think, and all the schools bring a show with them. They create a show specifically to deliver on stage there. There's a lot of talkbacks where people get to ask questions, critique the show, try to um, understand it and all that, and you also get to do a lot of workshops and create pieces with people from other schools. It's like it's like performance camp is what it is, and it's really cool. And CSUN goes every single year, which is really cool. And again, it gives you perspective too, because you meet people from different parts of the world, right? So what isn't
Right.
an issue to you might be to them, and vice versa. So that's what Pedagene is. And I think it was in 2019, the ensemble went to Pedagene, and we had a member of the ensemble who is, and I brought this up before, but she is vegan, right? So she wrote a piece on animal rights and um, how she views cruelty through her own lens. And she delivered this, but obviously the schools in the South have, um, well, they were sort of explaining how they experience a lot of food deserts. And the other version, it's not a food desert, it's another thing, like I forget what it's called. Let's
I
see.
like food desert. That's interesting. Okay, but there's a
Or
different phrase.
yeah, food apartheid, I think it's what it's called. I think a food desert is it's not food apartheid. What is it? Sorry, I'm trying to find what it is.
I wonder, this is a sidebar. You heard about the ransomware that shut down meat production? I wonder if this was part of her performance. That'd be pretty
Maybe.
badass, man, if that was part of her performance.
Oh, it's a food swamp. Um, so for
Food
example,
swamp.
yeah, so a food desert is when you live in an area where you don't have immediate or readily available access to fresh and healthy foods, right? So grocery stores and stuff like that. A food swamp is an area where you have an overabundance of like fast food, unhealthy food. So even though you do have supermarkets that has groceries, you have, let's say for one supermarket that has fresh produce, you have about 15 fast food joints within the block and liquor stores and stuff like that. So that's what a food swamp is. And so I think the students from the other schools, because a lot of them um, come from states and cities that still suffer a lot of the consequences of racist ideology, right? Because they're in the South, so a lot of them still bear that trauma, right? And so they were telling that students like, hey, like the way that you presented it wasn't cool because it almost feels like we're being shamed for not being vegan, but we don't have the means to be vegan. Um, and I thought it was interesting, and I think that I think it upset a lot of people um, from other schools, and I think it upset the person from the ensemble because they obviously didn't mean to do that, and they felt bad. But it's also understandable, right? The place that they were coming from, and I think that's why I wanted to compare this to the conversation that we're having because it really does put you in a room where sometimes the conversation is uncomfortable, but it has to be because then how else do you learn, right?
I
It
think that that's a great dynamic to describe that allow for tension, allow for it to be uncomfortable, but still stay respectful and try to build a bridge. But I don't want to mean to cut you off, but I just want to quickly just interject that there's two. I'm working on another couple of podcast episodes with my other podcast, Crazy Amazing Humans. We just finished an interview with someone who's talking about healthy eating and how we just feel like don't ask, don't tell kind of thing. I'm going to put it in my body. I'm going to eat it, consume it because it's on the shelf and it's labeled as food. But we don't stop and think, is this the best fuel for this engine, for this machine? You know, it's like putting, what do they say, putting water in a gas tank or something. If it doesn't, if it's not optimal, but we just feel like, and I believe this is true, and I'm just going to speak for myself. I labored under the assumption that food is food, and I didn't want to be like a crazy person and just go, oh my God, I got to only eat healthy things. But then I think to myself, well, now where did that come from? Where I label people who are really trying to be cognizant of what they eat as a crazy person, when the norm that we're all told is don't worry about it, or just try to eat well, yeah, but who cares? Eat McDonald's, whatever, because it's just part of our culture. And I think one thing about what you have described with this person's piece is that it challenges this definition of norm. And we don't like that. I feel like we just feel like many times, and again, I'm speaking for myself, many times you feel like, wait a minute, there's so many things coming at me. I've already kind of dealt with that issue. I'm just going to eat what I want. Don't reopen that can of worms. I got so many other things I got to deal with. And what's lovely about that piece, I think, and performance ensemble in general, we may have talked about this too, is that there's so many things hidden in plain sight. And when you look at life from someone else's perspective, it just is like, oh my God, that's been here the whole time and I never saw it. You know what I mean? And so
Mhm.
it is challenging because anything, you know, we've already set up our norms. And when you challenge that or you make me think twice about it, there's going to be some tension. But I would say that when you examine something like this, it deepens who you are as a human being. And so the second person that we're going to be interviewing soon is someone who speaks about men issues, okay? And what it means to be, what is it called? Aspirational masculinity. And so we as guys, not just white males, but men in general, there's a certain dynamic that we've been sort of presented or taught or convinced to be normal. And much of it is like, figure it out on your own. Don't ask me, and don't cry about it. And I used to work at a church where we would have these men's retreats, and the guys were so desperate to be authentic and just to kind of talk about real things other than sports, right? And so, and it doesn't mean sports are bad or talking about cars that you're passionate about are bad. They're not. But understanding this other, allowing this other dynamic, this other perspective to come to the fore. I think what we're saying here is this is what I'm going to say. When performance ensemble gets you to think about something and it becomes uncomfortable, but you get to deal with it and wrestle with it and make your opinion your own and live understanding that the world is not black and white, that we all have to deal with all these different dynamics and be empathetic towards one another. And that's how we create. And
Yeah.
that's what I think performance ensemble does so well, helps create and foster an empathetic society.
Yeah, and just to continue adding to what you were saying, but also to the example that I was using is, especially when we're talking about the strengths of the group, right? The strengths of being a member of the ensemble is that it's not just that you put the audience in a situation where it might be uncomfortable for them because they have to learn and unlearn things that are toxic, that are negative, that are upholding a lot of these like systemic oppressions, right? But it's also that you can find that you yourself find that you can be in a position that's uncomfortable because it is now you who has to learn because of the way that the audience responded to it or the way that your cohort has responded to it. And I think it was a lesson for both the person who performed it, even though they didn't mean anything bad by it. But I think it was a lesson learned for them, but I think it was also a lesson learned for the audience members, because clearly there's a divide sometimes, and I think that this contextualizes it with, well, what does that mean about the place that I hold and the role that I hold and the responsibilities that I now have socially for whatever issue it is that you're talking about. And even if it is uncomfortable, I think it really, like I said, it really forces you to have to learn or unlearn those things. And I think that's the power of it too, is it keeps you on check, you know,
Right.
is now you become more self-aware of your place in the world and how you would contribute to these issues. And I think that's really important too.
And I love the way these things challenge us. It makes us become a better version of ourselves.
Hmm.
We are constantly, I was reading something, I don't know if you've heard about Eric Erickson, who was a psychologist, and he has like the 8 phases of life, if you will. Like in the first phase, you learn certain things, in the next phase. So, and Shakespeare says, we're the same actor, but we're playing a bunch of different roles throughout our whole lives. And you would hope that the version of you now has grown from the version of you that was 10 years ago. But growth means sometimes can be painful because you're letting go of certain ideas and you're allowing yourself to learn others. And so this also ties into topic number 2, which is I wanted to bring up, and it's kind of associated, I would say, and that is education. Education. So we're talking about critical race theory in school, but how about in a more broad context? I heard a commentator talk the other day. I was just sharing with Fernando about college is a scam, and so why should we offer free college at all, and so forth. And because I taught public speaking, Fernando also taught public speaking. This is usually one of those topics, right, that come up. Like when you ask your students, okay, here's a bunch of things we can talk about. What would you like to give a speech on? Invariably, every semester, you get one student's going to talk about the pros and cons of why you should go to college, or maybe why college is not worth it. And so this is part of the idea of education. So I'm just going to throw something out there, and I want to acknowledge before I say what I'm going to say that that's a fair point. I don't know if Fernando would agree. I don't know if you're watching, you agree, but it's a fair point. Is college, this idea of college, is it something that's 100% applicable to all? I'm going to say probably not. I know people who are perfectly successful without going to college. I also, and there's the whole idea of student debt. I said death almost, student, but it feels like death.
Basically the same thing, yeah.
Yeah. And so, so there's a point of view to be considered. And so I don't want to come off as being one-sided, but again, we said this about 5 minutes ago. We live in tension. Life is in tension. In other words, it's never 100% one or the other. Because there's student debt, we shouldn't have college. You know what I'm saying? So, all right, so here's my 2 cents on this. I feel like and again, my own perspective, my own point of view, and Fernando's going to have his too. I have found that college is much more than just getting grades. And it's much more than, housing and so forth. It is a life transformation situation for a lot of the reasons that we've already discussed, which is challenging your notions of what is and exposing yourself to a lot of different ideas you never saw before. And so now here's the question possibly, is it worth the cost of college to get this experience? That's up to you. I mean, I certainly have taken out loans in my time. I've found other ways to pay for college. And so for me personally, I've been able to meet people that have made me a better person, Fernando being one of them. And I don't know and being in that realm of education, and this is why I think there are some political persuasions who say, I like uneducated people because I can manipulate them better. When you're in college, in general, you're asked to critique whatever you thought was the way it was, and consider what might be, and then test it, right, with evidence and so forth. We started off talking about critical race theory. Now I think we're segueing into just education or college in general. What do you feel about either what I just said or just this topic in general?
I think that my immediate response to it wants to go to this argument of ridicule that some people go through because of what they choose to study and the debt that they go into because of it. And it's interesting because we were talking about this, what is he, a pundit, I guess, a host of a TV show, and what he said about going to the university and it being a scam. But I think what's interesting is that I think that the larger conversation tends to look at certain choices as being a naive choice of being a reason to be ostracized, right? So if you decide to study gender studies or communication, for example, because a lot of people like bag on communication too, or whatever these other like non-STEM or non-traditional studies, right? And we look at people being in debt or being in a place where they don't want to be in terms of the career as being the result of studying these things and looking that as a problem instead of looking at the issue of debt as a problem, right? Like we don't look at the fact that we charge students $10,000 a year in tuition for boarding, even though they're commuting, as a problem. view whatever they study as a problem. You know, we say that, oh, maybe they should have studied something that's more um, quote unquote useful. And so that's what immediately I go to is that argument, because it really frustrates me. Um, because like you said, I also think that a lot of these things isn't just necessarily for the degree or for a specific job. Not everybody goes to university for that, right? And obviously not everybody is in a position where they can easily just study something because they want to, because maybe they can't afford it, or maybe they can't even afford to take out loans, right? Which sounds insane to say, because that's the whole point of loans, is because you can't afford something. But some people can't even afford to take out loans. um, and that it is for the experience. But I mean, I just go back to there being institutional and organizational issues, right? And I think that the university system is one of them. That I think that it offers a lot of good, but that it inherently is built on a broken foundation, essentially. All right, and I think that one thing that I always like to bring up, and I read this in Mike Davis's. I don't know if you know him. He does a lot of like political geography, a lot of critical cultural stuff. But he wrote this book, City of Quartz, and he was looking at the way that that Los Angeles as a city was planned out, and who was in power when the city was being built, when the U.S. was moving westward, and then also looking at the way that education has affected the area. And so we look at USC, one of the oldest universities here in Southern California, and how it was built by members of the KKK, and how it was specifically built to only hold white students, white men specifically. And I mean, it's just, I think that the universities as a whole have histories that are just problematic. Um, so that aside, like there's a lot of issues there, but I think that in and of itself, I think the university does provide a lot of, I think, different avenues for success for a lot of people, right? Because not everybody goes in for the same thing. The reason why I chose to study communication is different than the reason you chose to study communication, right? We ultimately wanted different things, but we had very similar experiences, and other people do it for different reasons too. I've also known people that didn't go to school are successful because they have their own businesses, but decided to go back to school for fun, or because they wanted to learn something, or because they wanted to keep themselves mentally engaged in different ways that they weren't receiving when they were just doing whatever it is that they were doing. Um, but I think that there's also a lot of arguments when it comes to education, especially higher education, that I think people need to have more of, that we need to have more of too, you know?
Do you feel, because one of the criticisms about college as well is, by the way, so before I ask that question, when I went to UCLA years ago, it cost me $3,000 a year.
You want to hear how much it costs to
So,
go to Berkeley for 1 year?
yes, I do.
It's 50,000 a year.
50, 50.
50 a year.
So it seems to me that if you want to have, and this was really a part of our DNA, especially coming out of World War II with the GI Bill and so forth. And in California, college was free. Why is that? Because education is valued. So if we say, yes, we want education for our people, but only those that can afford to go, what are we doing to the population?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're not honoring, and this is why there's this big debate right now about should we be allowing, say, community college for free nationwide and so forth. And I say that if you want to compete on again, forget social justice or anything like that. Just looking on pure economics, it seems to me that the more educated your populace, the more they can compete on the world stage, you know, against so many countries that are putting a high value on education. I just feel like that we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't allow more people to get this exposure to knowledge and challenging their thinking. And we're going to find all of these amazing gems, right? They don't all just come from one source, one race, whatever. And so it's sort of like deciding that we are making an investment in our people. And I'm kind of like, I saw some guy say the other day, and I don't want to get too political here, but he was saying, it seems to me from all indicators that the idea of trickle down just doesn't work. He's into trickle up economics. And I just thought that's an interesting, I kind of like that idea, right? Trickle up, meaning invest in the infrastructure of our society, invest in people who are going to, the pool is just so huge, and the resources, human resources that we would find are so huge. If you can invest in that and give more people opportunity, it just seems like
Yeah.
that would benefit everybody,
Yeah. I mean, if you don't
in
want to
my
get
humble opinion.
if you don't want to get political, I will. I'm just going to say trickle down theory is trash. It's never worked. It hasn't worked. It literally does
It
the
seems like
opposite.
every study, yeah, right,
Yeah.
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 So in dealing with education, yeah, there's always going to be, and here's another, let me ask you this quickly. Uh, another critique is that, oh, everyone who goes to college is exposed to liberal communist thinkers and who just are, just want to proselytize and make people, hate their country, hate whatever. What do you say to something like that?
um,
You.
I think that to me is just, it feels like the witnessing people reading a headline but not reading the story and making arguments based off of a headline, right? Like that's what it feels like. Um, because one, you have the free will to take whatever class you can, right? So if you take a class that literally teaches you Marxist theory, then yeah, you're gonna hear a lot of stuff like that, right? But if you take other classes, you're not gonna hear stuff like that. And I think too, I think the real important thing though when I hear stuff like that is understanding why people feel the need to feel scared. Not that they're actually scared, I think they want to feel scared. In the same vein of people who are in positions of privilege that want to feel oppressed, right? Like they find reasons to be, and I'm talking about people in power. There's a lot of, oh my gosh, it's just like you see it online too, even in the form of memes, because that's sort of how we talk to today, right? Like especially younger people. I've noticed a lot of my high school students do that too, or my college students. I mean, and the students that I like help out at the high school. But even in then, like you see people posting these things. It's like, oh, in 50 years when it's illegal to be Christian, or it's illegal to be this or be that, and I'm like, you're just you're dumbfounded. It's like you guys are in a position of power and you always will be. Like you're fine. Stop trying to pretend like you're oppressed. Um, but to answer your question, like I think it leaves you dumbfounded because one, not everybody attending the school is liberal. Like, I mean, let's take the school that we went to for as an example, right? Like Cal State Northridge. People think that like they don't want to go there because it seems like it's really liberal because it's close to LA or whatever. They don't recognize that it actually has a really huge number of um, conservative students or students who don't identify with any politics on the spectrum, or in the center, or right wing conservative. Like you have a lot of students that swing to the right, and that typically isn't even an issue. I think that it becomes a concern for those people because it's uncomfortable for them, and I think that they have to question why it's uncomfortable, right? Like I don't know. I consider myself really hardcore left leaning, and I think that you've noticed that. And I think you've noticed that when you met me, and I think I've gone more so in that way since doing this podcast too. Um, but when I hear things that are of a different perspective, it like it's like, okay, well, I mean, I can't really judge because I don't understand it, and I want to understand it more. Or do you think that we all come out as like communism? It's like, nope, I don't think so. I do believe in a lot of freedoms and a lot of rights to do certain things and bear certain things and do all these things. I just believe in more control. I believe in being more responsible. That's the difference. Um, but I
Yeah.
think that ultimately people should really question why they feel scared over it. You know,
Hmm.
you can make the
It
argument,
seems, go
but you have to
ahead.
question it because then it becomes baseless.
Yeah, I think that when I hear those phrases, and I like you, I've encountered lots of people across a wide spectrum of political beliefs, and I just feel when I hear that, like you said, I like the idea of understanding why are you afraid, And if they say that colleges are just bastions of liberalism, well, if by liberal you mean someone who's not frozen or super conservative. I'm not using the word conservative as a negative, like if this is your political persuasion, you might, but I'm not. But what I was going to say was, of course, colleges should be a bastion of liberal thinking because you're challenging what is. If you want to go to a college that's just going to indoctrinate you in what you've always been taught by the power, borrowing what you said, the powers that be, that doesn't seem like an effective education system. You
Mm.
want to challenge your thoughts, you want to own your thinking, and that means exposing yourself to different points of view and different political persuasions, different ethnicities, and so forth. And it just seems to me that the more you expose yourself to a wide swath of the human experience, the more liberal you'll be because you're trying to
Yeah.
incorporate more of what you now know is different realities other than your own.
Yeah, and actually that reminds me. I don't know if you heard when this was happening, where a lot of lawmakers were trying to make controversy out of the 1619 project. And I don't know if you've heard of the 1619 project. And
Of course, I love it. By the
yeah,
way, can we just give it a shout out? It's a podcast. Uh,
mhm.
I think, right, it's a podcast. I don't think it was on TV. I can't remember, but I listened to the podcast of it. The 1619 project is worth your time. I think I'm going to give it a thumbs up. I think, Fernando, you would too.
Yeah, absolutely. And all you have to do is just search up 1619 project New York Times, and you'll find everything you need to find there. Um, but yeah, I mean, and for anybody that doesn't know what it is, it literally is an educational initiative that attempts to sort of reframe the way that we understand US history, right? The way that the US became the US, where it isn't, oh yeah, the pilgrims came, the natives were peaceful and they had dinner together, because that never happened,
Right.
right? It just teaches you exactly what happened without trying to vilify anybody. It's what happened. Um, and it reminds me so much of that because, like you were saying, you're if you consume the information that you consume without double checking that it is correct, right, that it's not being distorted, then you're robbing yourself of one, an education, but two, the skills to critically analyze something, right? Like you're robbing yourself of that opportunity. And it reminds me of that because a lot of schools started adopting the 1619 project, and it became so big where lawmakers were starting to push to defund schools and universities that use that curriculum. So they will lose all their funding for it, or certain educators would be fired over it, right? Um, which is, oh my gosh, because there's an irony that I want to point out, and I don't know how to point it out. Um,
Just blurt it out.
I'm forgetting what I was trying to say. Um, oh, okay, so so the irony to me is because I like I've met a lot of people and I have friends who are also conservative, and I also don't mean that in a bad way. Like that's just what the title is, right? Like they're conservative, whatever. And that's fine. That's not an issue. Like if you identify as a Nazi, that's an issue, right? But this person's just conservative. Um,
Yes.
but they had a tendency to make arguments of um, wanting to keep certain um, both physical but also educational monuments to what happened in the South, right? Because it's history, and even if it's, and they would argue that even though it's uncomfortable, it's good for it to stand because you learn from it. And whether or not I agree with that, this situation applies too. And it's like people are upset that we're teaching critical race theory to students. And their argument is that it makes them feel uncomfortable. I'm like, wasn't that the same argument that you guys made for these other things? But it's not fine here. And there's an irony in that. And so I
Yeah.
just wanted to point that out. But you're right. Like if you're stuck receiving an education and always hearing something and always believing it and not questioning it and not trying to figure out whether or not that is the truth and whether or not it applies to the truth that you've come to understand, then you're robbing yourself of that experience and opportunity to think critically, to analyze things, to um, try to make sense of the world in a point of view that isn't yours, right? in a different standpoint. And like we always highlight standpoint theory for that exact same reason too. Is you're robbing yourself of understanding what the world is from a different standpoint.
You're without developing the ability to critique your thoughts and critique the thoughts of others, to understand, is this based on evidence, or is it just pushing buttons? Is it just saying dog whistles that I will just naturally respond to? You are leaving yourself open to be completely abused. And I feel like education in that regard is empowerment. It shows you that you do not have to allow other people to just manipulate you, because they can. You know, I always think about the example of magicians. Magicians just know how our brains work. And when they do a trick, they just know that there are blind spots. And so that's how they are able to get, you know, shift our focus over here so that the quarter disappears or whatever. But when you have the capacity to critique things, you are no longer susceptible. Well, I guess we are still susceptible, but it gives us the tools that say, okay, my first impulse is to hate or to judge or whatever, that the dark impulse that the people who know how to manipulate utilize. And unless we are able to kind of critique things for ourselves so that we can find our own voice, we are always going to be pawns in some game, and we may not know why. And so for that reason alone, I advocate for education. So, and this is why, getting back to PE, and then I want to kind of wrap up with us sharing a piece, because performance ensemble, we have written a couple of things, more than a couple of things. So it's always good to share. But in wrapping up, so performance ensemble, I think, is good for many, many reasons, but not the least of which is what we've been talking about, which is challenging your thinking. And if you're the one performing, as you so eloquently stated, Fernando, sometimes when you are in performance ensemble, your thoughts are challenged, your beliefs are challenged. And so, and it just in a very loving atmosphere. No one's coming at you with shame. Shaming never works. But when you can get someone to feel another person's reality, that that just is a profound influence on your thinking, I think, especially if you've never experienced something like that before. So that's kind of my sort of tie into performance ensemble. Would you say that's true, what I just said? Or how would you describe what how would you rephrase it in a much more coherent way?
No, I think that's perfect. And see, to me, it sounds coherent, but I'm pretty sure to others it might not have. And I think that also just perfectly describes what the experience is like, right? Like it,
Mm.
it is an incoherent coherence. It is organized chaos. It is something that sort of puts you in a place where you become comfortable being uncomfortable. And um I think it provides the tools for the what we discussed today, to place yourself in positions that maybe you didn't want to, and it forces you to learn, or forces others to learn, um, where you realize the points of your privilege, where you realize the points of other privileges, where you value your education in a different way because performance is different in that sense. But like you said, all of it is done in love, never in jest, and never in 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 judgment, but rather through critique, right? And so I think that that's the best way that I can word it.
So we will once again say, if you have never done performance ensemble and you have the opportunity to do so, please do it. Make that part of your life experience, not just your college career, but your life experience. And so what I'd like to do is awkwardly segue into sharing some pieces that we've written. And so Fernando, what is the piece that you're going to be sharing with us today?
I will be sharing a stanza of a piece I was writing with someone. It's titled "The Death of Los Angeles." It is the final stanza.
A very hopeful, yeah, a very hopeful title.
Yeah. Nestled between 4th and 7th, a street unremittingly in bloom, a block enraptured by an alignment of flickering lampposts, how we get lost looking up, bright spots scattering about. It is understanding that nothing lasts forever, not even the bright colors or the never-ending rattle of loosely fitted wheels. It is no longer never-ending, a caravan of calloused hands. It is understanding that one day you must part ways. It is always reminiscing to witness the crumbling of a concrete jungle in the city, a flower never in bloom.
Hmm. Hmm. So if you have lived in Los Angeles your whole life, or if you're like me, you're a transplant, but I've been here a long time, just you could see in my mind's eye, in my imagination as you were reading, I'm just picturing, the how things are constantly shifting, changing, not always for the better, and not always in a way that incorporates the what's best for all or the majority. And so I don't know if that's what you were going for, but that's certainly how it struck me. That damn, and that, so give me the title again. What is the exact title?
The Death of Los
Death
Angeles.
of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And so, what I've shared this with you before. I'm a sucker for great titles, and so automatically that title is so provocative, right? And so you're thinking, no, wait a minute, what can this mean? And it just, well, for me, your piece was just describing what is. It's not saying LA sucks. It just says this is just the way it is, and it's like a cool documentary or something. And then it leaves me to interpret it and feel it and think about it. Like, do I agree? Is LA dying a slow death? Is it whatever? It engages an dear audience. I don't know how it struck you, but that's how it struck me. So yay you. I'm a fan.
You know what's
Okay, so mine simply go ahead.
I don't know. I was just gonna say it's funny because whenever I reread it, there's throughout the whole thing, like because it's only two stanzas instead of my typical 1,000, um, is that I throw in a lot of words that are that pay homage to the streets of downtown. So like just bringing up the word flower, like Flower Street is a really popular street in LA, or bringing up the word temple or grand or spring. Um, and then so it's funny because like I forget that I did that. And so when I'm reading and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot that's what I did. So it's just really fun going
Hey,
back.
so quickly, I have to ask you before I read mine. I wanted to ask. So you said you co-wrote this one. That's unusual for you, is it?
It's really unusual. So the full piece I think is 3 or 4 stanzas, but I only wrote 2 of them. And they weren't written like I wrote them at the same time, but they're not actually, it doesn't follow one after the other. It's all sort of displaced. Yeah, and I've never written something with someone, not even in the ensemble. Like I've had people help me write the stage notes and write what my piece would look like on stage. I've never had somebody actually co-write with me. Um, but I think that's also just a quick shout out to. I think that's one of the cool things about being in the ensemble is that there are a lot of people who have co-written work pieces, and I think that's what's really cool because, you know how we were talking about that you can be of a different perspective from a different standpoint. Even within the own ensemble, you can. And so if you write something with somebody, even if they sort of live a similar life, it's still different enough for you to have different or maybe even competing viewpoints on things. And so when you co-write, it creates something I think is just so much more grand because of that.
Oh, I totally agree. I love collaboration, and even even when you start off with something that you've completely written, it's always a collaboration anyway, and putting it up on its feet. But I love that
Mhm.
you did this because it's not typical of you, and so you tried something cool and new, and just the mingling of those energies. I love that. So yay, awesome. All right, so mine will end with this. So Father's Day is just around the corner. We're in the month of June. I had a not pleasant experience with my father. Oh, yawn, daddy issues. Well, okay, so I'm one of those. And so as I was contemplating Father's Day, I think this was last year, I just wrote, so this is like a stream of consciousness, many of my works are. And so here we go. It's called Happy Father's Day. Don't say Happy Father's Day. Not one fucking word. There's nothing happy about it. You say you had a good father and your friends did too? Fuck you. Big fucking deal. So happy for you. Maybe that made you a better person. Maybe you could deal with life's shitstorms just a little bit better, knowing that you had some kind of psychological foundation to stand on. Good for you. But I don't give a shit. Glad you can keep the greeting card companies in business, letting them, some motherfucker who writes that shit for a living, give voice to your banal platitudes today and every other holiday. Be happy. You should relish your situation. Just don't expect me to. It's like telling me you have a full course meal while I'm on the other side of the bulletproof plexiglass, choking on some stale saltine crackers and a moldy slice of an old orange. Enjoy yourself, but I don't give a shit. What? I do. I cannot stomach this shit. Where do the rest of us go? What fucking holiday do we get? The disposed of, the chattel, the inconvenient, and the unwanted children who people would rather see less of and certainly not hear. I remember inadvertently making my father laugh when I was 10, and then desperately trying to get him to laugh again, trying over and over to no avail. That's because on that one accidental time, he was laughing at me, not with me. You get it? Yeah, so what? Millions of us have daddy issues. Doesn't make us special. It just keeps psychologists and psychiatrists in business. Happy vacation homes to you motherfuckers. I found out that the small print on my depression meds tell me not to drink. Well, fuck that. The more inoculations to pain, the better. So happy Father's Day. Happy Sperm Donor Day. Happy, sad, melancholic bullshit holiday in June. Let's get it over with. I'll hide under the bed shaking like a scared dog during a thunderstorm. It'll terrorize me, have its way with me, but it'll pass. And you? Well, you can have your family gatherings and your barbecues and your posed family photos that you can then paste all over your Instagram stories showing what a loving, happy family you have. Shit like that. Makes me want to smash my phone. Whatever. Just don't expect me to join in. Happy Orphans Day. Happy Children of Rape Day. Happy 3rd, 4th, 5th Marriage Day. Happy Wicked Stepmother Day. Happy Displacement Day. Happy Permanent Wound Day. Happy Stepbrothers and Sisters Day. Happy other 364 days, just not this one. Fuck you.
Man. So you know how we were talking about, I don't know if it was last week or a couple weeks before that, how like we have people that are coming in that are actors who like are transplants basically, like coming to LA because they want to be actors and then are sort of scared to join PE. I think what's interesting when I hear your pieces is that you can actually hear a script, like a more traditional script, but it it starts off there and it's just sort of it, it fades into something else that's not traditional. And so I think that's why to me it feels like you're just storytelling, like again just traditional storytelling, because it sounds like a script and it becomes something else. um and so it's like I'm watching a play, but I'm not. It's just you. It's like I'm watching a monologue, but it's not. It's just you minus the monologue part. It's something else. It's really hard to describe, but it's so good.
It's funny because you're right. I mean, we are all bringing everything that we've experienced to the fore to this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no denying that, yeah, I've done monologues and I've done stuff like that. I've never really written them. So these are, and certainly I've never had any monologue where it's like completely telling my life like these do. So, but thank you. Thanks, man.
That was so good. I am gonna have to crop that part out and post it on Instagram. That's gonna be the
Okay.
ad.
So I will, my caveat is if you did have a happy father or a happy childhood and a good father, that is miraculous and you should be thankful every single day, because it's when you don't have it, it gives you so much baggage you got to work through. So anyway, And on that, we do wish you a happy Father's Day, happy whatever day this is that you're watching
Yeah.
this. And thank you so much for being a part of what we do and for joining our conversation. We totally keep you in mind. We love that you're tuning in. We hope that you will check out Performance Ensemble and just kind of discover more parts of you so that you can be the best you can be. My name is Jefferson Denham.
My name is Fernando Martinez.
All right, you guys. So we'll see you next time. This is where we wave, and this is where
Yeah.
Fernando hits stop.
Yep. Nope. I need to learn how to do that.